two democratic states, Israel and Palestine.
Israel and Palestine.
Peaceful Israel alongside
independent and viable Palestine.
2 states for 2 people.
2 states.
Solution.
Promises, promises. After all, it is the promised land, right? So yeah, depending on who you ask, God promised this place to the Jewish people way back when. Turns out though, God wasn't so good at keeping his word, because over the centuries, this promised land kept changing hands between the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, Christian Crusaders, the Turks. So here we are, early 20th century. Palestine is ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and Muslims are the majority. Jews make up less than 10% of the population. But get ready for it. Here comes another promise, the Balfour Declaration. During World War I, Britain promised support for, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Basically, the Brits promised Palestine would become a Jewish state, despite kinda having promised it to the leader of the Arab world a couple years earlier, despite not having any real claim to it, despite never so much as running that idea by the people who actually lived there at the time. Sounds like a plan, guys. Jews were certainly stoked, and who could blame them? Millions of Jewish families were scattered across Europe and elsewhere around the world, longing for a state of their own. So then Britain beat the Turks in World War I and got their mandate for Palestine okayed by the League of Nations. Or, to put it more simply, Palestine became a British colony. Time for another promise. The world was basically like, you Palestinians sit tight. You'll get your independence when we decide you're good and ready for it. Gotta love imperialism. But that's when things got really awkward, because both the Jewish people and the Palestinians think they've been promised their own state. Meanwhile, Jews were moving to the region in droves. The Jewish population here increased more than 6 times between 1918 and the mid-1930s. And after all, this was more than fair, right? We're talking about ancient, primordial birthright Jewish land. But the Arabs who'd lived there for centuries were less than thrilled about all these foreigners moving in on what they saw as their homeland. That anger spilled into years of armed insurgency that was brutally quashed again and again, with thousands of Arabs killed. So it took a few decades, but London was finally like, we probably need to do something about this, right? They decreed that European Jews could no longer just up and move to Palestine all willy-nilly, and that a joint state would be created in 10 years. But that made European Jews particularly unstoked, as Adolf Hitler had already weaseled his way into the picture in Germany. And Arabs weren't happy either, because now they had to wait 10 more years for a state, only to have to share it with the very same people they'd just been fighting. But then World War II broke out, and Britain had bigger fish to fry. And after the war, London simply handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations, which decided to split the land into 2 states. Arabs voted against the plan, but never mind. It's 1948, the State of Israel is born, and is then immediately attacked by a bunch of Arab nations. Each had its own goals in mind, but all ended up losing the war. Israel expanded even further, and 700,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes. The decades that followed saw more fighting, more bloodshed, more land grabs, and more refugees. So this is what the map looks like today. This is the state of Israel, and this is the state of Palestine. Well, not really a state. It's recognized by 136 countries. It has a president, and it's even a member of the International Olympic Committee. But it's almost entirely occupied by Israel. Let's break it down. The Palestinian territories consist of the West Bank and Gaza. In the West Bank, these tiny pockets of land are the only places where Palestinians are in full control. They're governed by President Mahmoud Abbas and his Fatah party. Everywhere else, Palestinians live under the watchful eye of the Israeli army, which monitors and controls their movement 24/7. Why? To protect the up to 600,000 Israelis who've moved in and settled the occupied territories. Who cares that it's illegal under international law? And the number of these Israeli settlers is consistently on the rise, which means less land and more checkpoints for the Palestinians. Despite all that, Fatah is in favor of having dialogue with Israel. Over here, this is Gaza, where, without putting too fine a point on it, it's been hell on earth for years. 3 massively destructive wars with Israel have left more than 2,300 civilians dead, and a horrifying humanitarian disaster for the families that are left. All made worse by a 12-year-long land, air, and sea blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt as protection from Hamas, an Islamist group that took over this area from Fatah more than a decade ago. Hamas's particularly charming brand of dialogue involves lobbing rockets and mortars at Israel, even using suicide bombings to get its message across. But critics maintain Israel's response has been way beyond what's necessary to keep its citizens safe. Food shortages, next to no clean water, only a few hours of electricity a day, that's the reality of living in Gaza right now. To make matters even worse, way too many powerful heads of state around the world, and particularly in the West, are perfectly okay with Israel's occupation. So it doesn't really matter whether the Palestinians are sitting down for dialogue with the Israelis or lobbing makeshift mortars at them from across the border. When you look at the big picture, it seems pretty obvious the struggle is only going to get worse.